Welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't yet know Sarah, she is a design futurist and innovation researcher who specializes in tracking and forecasting trends and critically evaluating futures visions. Her writing and research has explored subjects ranging from ambient AI to solar power, from the circular economy to the rise of biodesign. And she was previously head of consumer tech at WGSN, and she is now working independently as a futures consultant, writer, speaker, and visiting lecturer. And her new book, which we'll be talking to her about today, is Designing Hope, Visions to Shape Our Futures. So welcome to Marketing Kind, Sarah. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So I'd love to dig in with what originally drew you to exploring futures.
Well, it was entirely accidental. So to give you the short version, I studied design at university. I studied design because within design, you can explore everything else. And I could never at any point decide what to focus on. And design meant that I didn't have to decide. So I studied design, found out that the part of it that I enjoyed the most was research, and then thought, well, how? That's not even a career. Don't know what to make of that really. Discovered completely accidentally that this industry called trend forecasting existed and thought that it sounded perfect because it was all about design and futures research. And then spent about 15 years working in that industry, and I was always drawn to the further out futures. So trend forecasting works about 2 years ahead because commercial brands are thinking at most about 2 years ahead. And I was always drawn to that 5 to 10 year time horizon, which some futurists will think is very near term, and some futurists will think is quite far away still. And so I broadly just kept moving into design futures. And I define design futures really broadly as thinking about the future of products and spaces and experiences and interactions. So rather than stopping at these really big abstract futurist ideas like geopolitical tensions or an aging population or the kind of classic futurist terrain, I then move that into what does that mean for design? What does that mean for people? And what does that mean to the actual tangible environment around us and the things we'll be designing and making?
That's really helpful context. And I love what you said about it, design allowing you to do everything. Writing a book isn't an easy thing. So what got you over that hurdle to actually go ahead and write a book?
It was very purely a problem solving approach, which I think shows my design background again, because we're inherently problem solvers. So about 3 years ago, I was starting to think about writing it. And at that time, there was just a lot of discourse, dialogue around the fact that we don't think about the future anymore. And when we do think about the future, there's nothing to think about. Like the future had kind of ceased to exist. And that still exists as a sentiment to some extent today, but I think it is changing today. So one of the things that I do when I give lectures about the book and about designing hope as kind of a broader theme is I have a slide where I've gathered all of the future's cliches and stereotypes of kinds of the way we visualize the future. And it's all really techie. It's things like the Minority Report displays and holograms and cars without wheels and Metropolis with the flying cars and the highways. And the reason that I show the slide is to ask people if anything has changed since I first put that slide together 3 years ago in how we picture the future. And the one change that I think now is that we have a lot more of a visualization of collapse and climate apocalypse than we used to have, because things are getting so dire in our modeling and our data, as you will all know, around the future of the environment and what's going to actually happen to our planet as we continue to destroy it, that climate apocalypse, that kind of Mad Max scorched earth image is becoming more present in our imagination. So I don't think it's so much now that we don't visualize a future, but I do think it's still that we're visualizing really scary and bleak and dystopian futures. I don't think that has changed very much. So in answer to your original question, I wrote the book because I was seeing these headlines around we can't picture the future anymore, we don't have new ideas about the future. And my entire career has been in tracking these ideas of the future that we have and putting them together into really cohesive narratives for clients and presenting them in a very accessible way. And I think futures thinking, which is what I do and probably what you do to some extent as well, because we all do think about the future, I think futures thinking is this really underrated skill, and we're not actually formally taught it. It's something that we all can do, but we're really not confident doing it because we don't have any training, we don't have any education in it. And I very idealistically thought that if I could take my education and my knowledge and my skills and put them into a book format that people could work through, and I could explain how to think about the future and why it's exciting and interesting to think about the future and not just depressing and scary, then that can make a difference to this collective imagination we have about what the future could hold.
You talked about there being a sort of a retrenchment in our ability to imagine the future, and that future thinking is a skill. A widespread criticism of Keir Starmer, for example, is that he lacks a detailed vision, a mobilising vision of the future to work towards. And I wonder, is there a sense in which that particular instance or that observation, is there a deeper, more collective story that, you know, as a collective, we have a sort of narrative failure in terms of being able to write our way into a better future at this moment?
I think so. I think there are so many factors keeping us in the present and anchoring us to this kind of permanent present that we can't escape from. And there's also this bigger issue that a lot of our ideas about the future are tied up in this idea of progress that we've had for a long time now. And the idea of progress itself has become quite problematic and quite complicated because it was that progress that was tied to increasing emissions and degrading the environment. So there's now kind of guilt associated with progress and with technology as well. So much of the conversation around AI and the worry around AI is its ecological impact. Mm-hmm. So we've become very polarized between people kind of who can imagine a better future and people who kind of can't, because they know that the true impact of that very high-tech future is really worrying for the environment and for society. So yes, a narrative failure, but we are also very constricted by just being kept inside this dystopian way of thinking. Because I think when the future is shown to us in news headlines or in climate modeling is necessary, but they're always negative futures. They're always statistics that just sound terrible. And the positive visions don't necessarily come with statistics. They come with creativity and imagination. And we don't make as much room for creativity and imagination in our culture as I think we should. So part of this idea of better images of the future and more hopeful images of the future is cultivating creativity and putting a value on imagination and narrative, which I think we can do. We just need the right strategies.
The present system has many flaws. Specifically in terms of thinking about the future, an aspect of contemporary capitalism seems to be an increasing financialized focus on short-termism. And you talked about the fact that, you know, in your previous role, you were primarily looking over a 1 to 2 year horizon. Now, a lot of radical change can happen in 1 to 2 years, but nevertheless, there's something in the framing of, well, we're looking at 1 to 2 years, which seems to imply a more incremental level of change. How much of a struggle, what do you find either holds, when you have worked with clients, what holds businesses and organizations back from being able to really embrace a deeper future? And what are the sort of arguments or approaches that you use to help them open up to a longer term perspective, such as the ones that we're about to dive into?
Well, I should caveat by saying that working with brands and working in a corporate environment, it's honestly not always possible because that short-term motive is so heavily incentivized. It can't always be overcome. If you're not working for a brand who has that capacity for long-term thinking within its culture and within its own system, it's going to be near impossible to affect that from the outside. So as an example, I did a visioning for 2050 workshop with a really big global brand. I was really excited to go because I thought visioning for 2050, you know, that's still decades away. There can be so much transformative change by then. And we got into a conversation about capitalism and we were told, well, you can't imagine a world beyond capitalism or with a different economic structure because that's not realistic by 2050 and this has to be realistic. And it was a real reality check of even big global brands with a lot of power don't feel they can transcend these systems and these structures. So I think part of it has to be finding a way in by working with the brands who do have that ambition of driving change. And I think that's what a lot of you will be doing, is working with brands who do have at least an interest in being change makers, and then can be encouraged or pushed or collaborated along to the next step of finding that ambition and finding that purpose and going for it. And we do see this a lot at the moment. I think there are a lot of positive tipping points at the moment, but they're not necessarily coming from corporations. I think a lot of them are coming from cities and councils. So Amsterdam committing to ban fossil fuel advertising and getting this really aggressive pushback from an advertising provider who emailed them saying there will be legal consequences to this decision. But those councillors having the courage to say, well, we're going to do it anyway, and we'll face the legal consequences when they come. I think there's some really inspiring leadership on show, but it's not necessarily, unfortunately, coming from most of the brands that I would have worked with in my career.
Yeah, we've seen that leadership with local government in the UK as well on banning fossil fuel ads. Some city regions are taking those steps. And we did a session with Victoria Harvey on that last summer. And I do want to get into the heart of your book, which are these 4 emerging movements of futures thinking. And I'd love to... I recommend everyone read the book, because that's how they're going to get the most from this. But for anyone that hasn't read the book yet and might be thinking about it, can you share a little bit about those 4 emerging futures movements and why you chose those out of what was available?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 4 futures visions are the ones that I think are the strongest and most cohesive narratives. And they're not only a political narrative or a technological narrative or a creative narrative. They're present across all different elements of our culture and our society. And they're gaining momentum, and they're really relevant, and they're real in that they're being made and they're happening. But they're also speculative in that they can be pushed much further. And if they want to gain traction as a dominant narrative, then they will need to grow and be cultivated. And some of them are very, very old, and some of them are very new. So a few of them go back centuries, and one of them was created in this century. It's only about 10 years old, and it was created because of the rise of the internet and the rise of blogs. It was very tied to the messages and the kind of formats of communication that were rising at the time, which I think is really interesting. So the 4 futures are more than human, degrowth, solar punk, and the metaverse. I think most people in this audience will be familiar with degrowth, possibly with more than human, although you might not know the name. So more than human futures challenge this idea of human supremacy and invite us to see ourselves as part of nature, not as separate to nature. So one of the questions that I ask to kind of open up this theme and explore this theme of more than human is, what would buildings look like if we designed them for the needs of plants and animals and bacteria, as well as for human needs? So it's a very kind of radical natural viewpoint that has its roots in indigenous teachings and relational economics. It's a very, very ancient way of seeing life and seeing the world, but it's highly relevant today. Degrowth, of course, came from an economic basis, an economic root, but it's really expanded and become quite a cultural vision of the future as well. Solar punk, people haven't always heard of this one. This is the new one. So this is the one that rose with blogs and the internet and YouTube and basically digital culture. And it's really, really collective. And it also arose at a time when climate anxiety and this awareness of the reality of climate breakdown was starting to hit the mainstream in a way that it hadn't prior to that, around just before the 2010s. And so solar punk is this movement that reclaims the idea of climate hope and rejects climate doom and despair. And it's natural, but it's also technological, and it's also very community driven. I think all 4 of the futures in the book are actually quite community driven. One of the overarching themes that I identify is that it's this shift back from the individual back to the collective and the communal. And then the final theme, metaverse, is a fascinating one because it is a very tech theme, but it's also a really, really social idea of the future. If you think about the metaverse in terms of its possibility, rather than just being something that Mark Zuckerberg tried to force on everyone during the pandemic, there's so much potential for a radically accessible future, because the metaverse says, what if we redesign everything from scratch using virtual technologies? We could make all the decisions afresh, and we could make different decisions, and they could be socially really positive decisions. So although the metaverse to a lot of people will seem like a dead future because tech companies have kind of moved on, I think there's still a lot of potential in it.
Yeah, I loved how you described them all in the book. And I think that there are many of us will be somewhat familiar with them. And so you kind of think you know it, and then maybe even dismiss some of them. So really digging into them, it was like I could see something in all of them that I really did desire in the future and want to see happen. And even the metaverse, which I agree I had very preconceived notions about. But you're writing on the design possibilities, the space for testing and learning in the metaverse is really captivating and needed. And so I definitely recommend everyone read the book and dig into these 4 futures movements. And I think there is so much that we can all see about our own lives in them and what we can contribute as part of these movements, which is exciting. But I'd love to hear from your research if there are social and environmental movements that you came across as examples in these that really stood out to you.
Oh gosh, well, you've had some amazing speakers at these events before. So transition towns were obviously a fantastic one. Transition towns are kind of an awkward example because I think I put it in degrowth, but it's so big. It's such an exercise in systems thinking. It's so transformative on so many levels that I think it could fit in lots of different ideas of the future. One of my favorite ones is regenerative design and how we can make different products from a regenerative lens. And this maybe doesn't sound so social, but I think it's quite social in terms of the environment. So the example that I really like is alga vodka. And this is a vodka that is made by distilling algal blooms that have gathered on rivers and on lakes because of human-made pollution and the way we kind of eject pesticides and sewage into rivers and recreate this phenomenon, which is really destructive to biodiversity. And alga vodka, by taking the algae out and actually using it as a raw material to make vodka, and also to make the packaging for the vodka and the paper that the vodka is packed in once it's in a glass bottle. What I love about that is it's a regenerative approach. It's actually repairing the damage that humans have made, not living sustainably, but actively restoring wildness and restoring nature. But it doesn't feel at all worthy. We're not asking anyone to eat an insect burger or give up meat or stop driving their car or flying. We're saying, have something extra, have a really delicious glass of vodka. And vodka's so hedonistic and decadent, nobody needs it at all. And that kind of contrast to your stereotypical environmental messaging of you have to sacrifice things, you have to give things up, you have to change. No one is going to resent being offered a glass of vodka, even if they don't want it. And I think that joyfulness is what makes that example so interesting to me, because it kind of flips that narrative really beautifully.
Yeah, definitely. As you say, we've had Rob Hopkins, co-founder of the Transition Town movement, on with us earlier this year, talking about how to fall in love with the future. And in previous exchanges and sessions, we've had Amanda Scott talk to us about Protopia and how to narrate our way to a better future. And we've also discussed Protopia with Richard Wayne and with Rupert Reed as well. So we've gone into these different kind of ways of creating a more positive future that's not dystopia or utopia. But in the book, you talk about Protopia, which I hadn't come across before. And so it'd be great to share what is Protopia and why do you feel it's important?
Yeah, we've got so many topias now, haven't we? We're have an abundance of topias. I do think that you guys will know everything at this point with everyone you've spoken to and all the theories of the future. I think you're really set up to do this. You probably don't need me to help, but Protopia, it doesn't have to replace Throughtopia. I think Throughtopia is really beautiful as well, but Protopia is my preferred way of thinking about it, because for me it's very generative, but it's also very pragmatic. So Protopia has a bit of a history as a word, but the word itself means a future that is beyond a utopia or a dystopia. It's another option, because if we don't have another option, we get stuck in this binary. And I said that we're not taught how to think about the future. The one thing we are taught from a really young age is that it's going to either be perfect or terrible. It's going to be utopia or dystopia, and we have to just divide it into one of those two things. And even if it's a utopia, it will become a dystopia, because utopias just can't exist. They're impossible. They would also be really boring, because nothing would happen. It would just be this state of really boring, perpetual kind of feeling fine. And we really like conflict and drama. And that's why we turn utopias into dystopias. So beyond that binary, what Protopia does is just expand the thinking space. And the word itself comes from Kevin Kelly, who was one of the founding editors of Wired magazine and a big name, a big influence in thinking in the tech industry. And he defined it in 2011 because he wanted to make space for different futures and for different possibilities as well. And he designed Protopia as a state today that is better than yesterday, even if it's only a little better. So that definition of Protopia might sound really unambitious. I don't think it is unambitious. I think it's setting the stage for, it doesn't have to be incredibly better for everyone, because no future is going to be better for everyone. Some people will be left out in that better future. Some people won't have been thought about. Some people will experience less, while other people experience more. So it's setting the context for a future that is better in some ways, the same in other ways, and maybe a bit worse in some ways too. So it can be ambitious, it can be really dreamy and amazing, but it's not going to be utopia. I think that's really important. And then Monica Bielskita, who was a futurist as well, she came along in 2021 and she redefined Protopia. She didn't like the origins in techno-optimism. She wanted to make Protopia more inclusive and more radical and more ambitious. And she talked about it as prototyping of hopeful futures. And she wanted them to be futures that considered a much wider range of people and took in a much wider range of viewpoints and perspectives. So Protopia is this evolving concept. And I think that evolving nature of it and how wide it is really useful. Also, the fact that it's not something we get through or something we arrive at. So Kevin Kelly says it's a state today. So he says it can be a future that exists today. So it's all quite kind of slippery and complicated. And I think that makes it interesting as an idea.
In the book, you quote Rebecca Solnit saying that apocalyptic thinking is a narrative failure, which Paul touched on earlier. And that really feels like a challenge to marketers when we're not doing our jobs well. If there is this narrative failure to see a better future. So how can marketers, where are the missed opportunities that we should be taking up to help society, help our customers, all our stakeholders to see a more positive future?
Oh, that's a huge question. Okay. Well, before I try and answer that absolutely massive question, I want to give you a book recommendation. Maybe you've had him at this event before, who knows, but it's called Everything Must Go. It's by Dorian Lynskey. And it's cultural history of apocalypse and how it's been presented in fiction, correlating the fiction, so the films, the books, the TV shows that are being produced with the social circumstances at the time, right back from how the church encouraged a certain conception of apocalypse and how religions thought about apocalypse, through to the world wars and how they influenced how we thought about apocalypse, through to the nuclear bomb, which actually dominated our vision of apocalypse for a long, long time, and now climate breakdown and how that is shaping actually how we picture apocalypse. I read it after I wrote my book, which I'm so thankful for, because I would have ended up unknowingly plagiarizing some of his ideas. It's a brilliant book, and I think he'd be a brilliant guest as well. yeah, we love apocalypse, and we love it because it's the end of the story. And there's a narrative failure, but humans don't suffer from any lack of kind of craving narrative and using narrative in our lives. We all kind of see ourselves as the main character in this story we're telling about our life. And when we think about our own personal futures, like my 5-year career plan, or whether I want a family, or whether I want to move house, that personal future is quite in place for a lot of us. But then this bigger future, that's where the thinking can become constrained, or where we might think, well, the story's going to end. So climate breakdown can feel like a story that is ending, or at least a transition from one story to another. I think part of the challenge that marketers face, and you absolutely need to correct me here if I'm speaking out of turn, because I don't work in your industry and I don't have your experience. I think part of the challenge is going too big or too small, kind of setting it at the right pace and at the right level of ambition, because environmental language and socially responsible language has been guilty in the past of being so tiny, this thing that George Monbiot calls micro-consumerist bollocks, like just buy a reusable cup, or stop using paper straws, just try to recycle more, everything will be fixed. Like, turn out the lights when you leave the room, everything will be fixed. But then at the other end of the scale is this idea that's growing at the moment of planetary responsibility, and that every decision we make is a planetary decision, which is true, of course, but is completely overwhelming and demotivating. And the average person feels that they have no impact in the bigger scheme of things. So finding the right pace of change and scaffolding people up that pace of change to bigger impact, and scaffolding companies towards bigger impact, I think is really useful. So one of the tools that we use in futures thinking is that scaffold from the future that we want to see, this actual vision of the future, back to the present day. And if we're building that scaffold or that ladder, where does it start? And what happens along the way? What happens at each phase? And every phase gets bigger and more systemic and more transformative. I think that can be a useful approach or useful language to use.
Sort of different futures, I guess, at different points in time. In a lot of human history, the future may have been not that different. In some periods of history, the future might have been primarily about religious reform. In other periods, the future has been about inventions. And one of the things that really struck me in the book was your observation that when you ask people to imagine a futuristic scenario, what people tend to default to thinking, a sort of sci-fi vision, actually hasn't changed for quite a few decades now. And so I guess, in the period sort of up to and from the end of World War II, there was a lot of inventions that changed life: the dishwasher, the washing machine, much more widespread ownership of cars, flights that are reliable and get you places quickly. That kind of has calmed down a bit. In fact, with the end of Concorde, it takes longer to get to the US than it did previously. But instead, the future has been about new types of connectivity, connecting to each other and connecting to information in different ways. Is there a sense that the future that we're waiting for is about different ways of organizing ourselves in society? And in a sense, that's a tricky one for businesses to get right, because inventions is a thing you can put in a pipeline and it pops out the other end. But new ways of organizing ourselves, new values across society, even for very big businesses, it's hard for anyone to be big enough to do that alone. So
to make money out of it.
What's your sense of this kind of trajectory of the kind of future that we're waiting for now? And is it about different ways of organizing ourselves?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of it is systems change, as you've already pointed out, or ecosystems change, so relational change. And relational change is messy and hard and really, really thankless. Activists have arguably the biggest experience of relational change, changing people's minds, building up relationships, having conversations, working with people rather than shutting them out or turning against them. And we're not sometimes very good at that, and particularly with this political environment of extreme polarization, it can feel like we're moving further away from each other rather than moving towards each other. So the relational work can be really scary and also seem quite boring. But the hard truth of it is that that is the work that matters. I've seen some amazing examples of companies working together, creating joint initiatives, creating joint coalitions. So the example that comes to mind is probably quite an obvious one, but the Tony Chocolonely kind of anti-slavery in chocolate, where they're working together, creating momentum, exciting people. That's another example of a brand that is exciting rather than worthy. And bringing people along with them by getting them excited and showing them it can be done, and then scaling up the ambition of it. That's a really nice example of almost an activist approach that a brand has taken and been quite authentic along the way with it. But if we go back to this idea of sci-fi, I've been a science fiction reader my whole life, which is probably partly why I was quickly drawn to futures, because I was like, all the books I like are talking about this kind of thing. So a lot of that Star Trek science fiction of the inventions, the Jetsons kind of futures where we have gadgets, you're right, that's really, really entrenched and possibly getting less relevant. But there's 3 authors who are really relevant today and kind of rising in popularity. Octavia Butler is always referenced since, the dawn of the 2020s, because she foresaw so much of what was coming politically and socially. And there's Kim Stanley Robinson, who's also become much more prominent this century with Ministry for the Future. And another one is less known, called Becky Chambers, who is, I think, the most transformative, because she presents science fiction that is unlike anything else you will have ever read. It's incredibly inclusive, incredibly radical, and it flips what you would expect from a narrative. So where I said that utopia is boring and dystopia is compelling because it's really dramatic, she completely flips that on its head. And she rejects this dystopian narrative, and she introduces this new kind of narrative that is so different for science fiction. But what all of them have in common is that a lot of their books, a lot of their novel is about people sitting in rooms and talking and working things out. And if you've read Kim Stanley Robinson, half of his books are just meetings. They're transcripts of meetings where diplomats and bureaucrats sit down and try to work things out. And the other 2, to the same extent, are about social activism and community building. But I think the future is going to be pretty heavily focused, rather than gadgets, it's going to be focused on people getting together and talking things through and trying to work things out.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us today and sharing the ideas from the book with us and everything you've learned in researching for it and since.